Well, hello, Dr. Philip Ovadia. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'm really happy to have you as a guest on the Keto Podcast and to offer you a podium so that the Dutch and the Belgian listeners and viewers can get to know you. And also your book that has been translated recently into Dutch. I have it right here. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your personal story?
Sure thing. Great to be here with you. Really excited to connect with the audience over there and for the book translation, which, like you said, just came out. So, Dr. Philip Ovadia, I am a heart surgeon. I have been a heart surgeon now for 20 years. And during much of that time, I was actually a very unhealthy heart surgeon. And I had reached a point about 10 years ago where I was morbidly obese, very overweight. I was pre-diabetic, and I recognized that I was going to end up on my own operating table, so to speak. I was following the same path that so many of my patients had followed. Your audience is probably aware that heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States and worldwide. And it is a major concern when it comes to our health. And I started asking, why I was so unhealthy when I was following the advice, that I had learned to give my patients, and why so many of them were following the advice, but they were still ending up on my operating table. And ultimately, that led me to down a path that I improved my health. I eliminated sugar and carbohydrates from my diet. I went on a low carbohydrate diet. I was able to lose, a significant amount of weight. I was able to reverse my pre-diabetes. And that has now, I've been able to maintain that now for, going on 8 years, which is something I had never been able to do in the past. And along the way, I came to recognize that we were treating heart disease wrong because we weren't addressing the root cause of heart disease, what actually causes heart disease. And that is, inflammation in our bodies from the food that we are eating, insulin resistance, which is something I'm sure your audience will be familiar with, but we can talk about more, and metabolic health. And so I'm on a new journey now. I still am a heart surgeon. I still work as a heart surgeon, but I am increasingly focused on keeping people off of my operating table. And so I wrote the book about 18 months ago, Stay Off My Operating Table.
Yeah.
And I hope that gives people the guide that they need so that they can avoid heart disease, because heart disease is largely avoidable and preventable.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing this kind of information with the people out there who are also looking to improve their metabolic health and their heart health, but also to make this knowledge more easily available for other health professionals. Because in the Netherlands and in Belgium, I don't know what it's like in the United States, but here doctors and dietitians are still very much holding back and not easily changing their old nutritional advice. And we can easily suggest that the old advice is not working because, well, like you said, the heart disease is still the #1 killer in the world. So let's just have a look at your book. Because in part 1, it's or part 2, I think it's all about the myths. There are 12 myths you mention about nutrition and health. Could you talk us to 3 of those myths?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I think probably the most important myth in there, as you mentioned, is, our approach to the food that we're eating. And, here in the United States, that takes the form of the food pyramid, the U.S. dietary guidelines. That concept has largely spread throughout the world. And essentially, it is saying that, the way to avoid heart disease is by avoiding fat in your diet. Eating a low-fat diet, especially avoiding saturated fat from things like red meat. And the evidence is to the contrary. We have been promoting that way of thinking now for, 40 years essentially. And we have not really made a noticeable impact on the incidence of heart disease during that time. So, I think that dispelling that myth is one of the, is the important thing that we need to get out of both the minds of practitioners, physicians, health coaches, dietitians, and the people, because it's simply not working. A related myth then becomes, that high cholesterol is really the primary cause of heart disease. And this is another important thing that I want people to start to change their thinking on. And it's a very nuanced discussion, but cholesterol isn't what starts the process of heart disease. Cholesterol plays a part in the process of heart disease, but if we want to have a meaningful impact on preventing heart disease, we need to address what causes it, what starts it in the first place, and not just be focused on a downstream problem like cholesterol. That I think is a very important myth for us to overcome. And the final myth that I think I would highlight is that, the myth that it is normal to become unhealthy as we get older, as we age. This again, very prevalent. We look around us and we see that most people get sicker as they get older, and we think that that's normal. But it's not normal. It doesn't need to be that way. And again, if we address the root cause of our health problems, the food that we are eating, we can remain quite healthy long into our older age.
Yes, exactly. Well, these are three very important myths. There are more, but I suggest people can read the book if they want to learn more about this. How was your book received by your colleagues, by other cardiologists or cardiac surgeons?
Yeah, so it I say would be a mixed reaction. I think many physicians are realizing that we are fighting a losing battle, that we are not making progress when it comes to heart disease. And, unfortunately, most of them respond to that by saying, well, people must not be following our advice, and we must not be doing these things well enough. We need to lower the fat even more, lower the cholesterol even more. But the more open-minded ones, I think, are stepping back and saying we must be taking the wrong approach because we're not just seeing the expected results. Yeah. And I think my book, puts forth another approach. And I think there's lots of evidence to support the approach. And most of them are open to it. One of the things I tried to do in the book was really just focus on the simple concepts, the commonalities that we see in successful approaches. So, when we look at all the different dietary approaches, and, we'll go into this discussion more, and I certainly go into it more in the book, what are the commonalities that we find in people that have success? And ultimately, at a high level, that the one commonality that I point to is the more that you eat real food and you eliminate processed food, the better your health is going to be. So, there are lots of different ways of doing that. And that's, again, something I talk about in the book. But on a high level, I just want people to start eating real food. And, quite honestly, most physicians wouldn't disagree with that. It's some of the detail that maybe we start to disagree on, but eating whole real food, I really don't think is that controversial a recommendation.
No, exactly. Because you also give advice in another section of the book, so what people can eat for more metabolic health. Can you name a few tips that you give in the book?
Yeah, so like I said, the first tip is eat real food, and what that means is eat the things that grow in the ground, and eat the things that eat the things that grow in the ground. So plants and animals. The balance between the two, is going to depend somewhat on your preferences, and it's going to depend somewhat on your situation. The more metabolically unhealthy you are, the more insulin resistant you are. And certainly if you've been diagnosed with something like type 2 diabetes, your body is not going to be able to process carbohydrates. So you're going to need to take a lower carbohydrate approach. I do believe, and I want people to understand, that there are unique benefits to animal products. These are the foods that we evolved eating, and I do think that they provide important, unique benefits for our health. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible to be healthy if you're a vegan, or if you're a vegetarian and you're excluding animal products. It just makes it more difficult because there are certain key nutrients that we cannot get from plants. More so, I want people to understand that it is okay to be eating red meat. Red meat is not damaging our health, and it is not damaging our hearts. These are some of the concepts that I talk about that I want people to understand as they're trying to change the foods that they are eating. The other, high level concept that really has gotten lost in medicine these days is the food that we eat is the primary determinant of our health. All too often when you're dealing with the medical system and something is wrong, you've developed a medical condition, you've developed a problem, the solution that's put forward is medications, surgeries, procedures of different kinds. And we don't step back and say, is this related to the food that we are eating? And should we be considering changes in the food that we are eating to deal with this problem?
Yeah, exactly. That's often all overlooked, and it's very strange to find out that most doctors don't even learn about nutrition in all those years of university. Yeah, I guess it's the same in the United States as here in Europe, but yeah.
Yeah, honestly, my experience is that it's worse, in the United States. I think our focus on nutrition has gotten completely lost. And it really, I think largely in Europe, outside the United States, there is still, some better recognition of that. Now, doctors still don't get the education that they probably should be on that front. And as we discussed, the messaging around it is oftentimes misguided. But that's a big issue. And you're right, physicians should be focused on what people are eating first and foremost, because that is the primary determinant of our health.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I find it very interesting to see that you do not focus on one specific kind of diet, like you just said, and you take the reader into several kinds of diets so they can improve on their own preferred diet. I see carnivore, Atkins, keto, low carb, the Mediterranean diet, gluten-free, vegetarian, vegan. And I think that's very liberating, because most books are focused on one kind of diet, and they only advocate their own diet or their own vision, but you just take several diets into account. But which one do you follow yourself? Which one has changed your life?
Yeah, so my life really changed by going low carb, keto, and for the past 4 years I have been carnivore. A largely carnivorous diet. I don't think we need to be 100% dogmatic about these things. I say I am mostly carnivore, which means that on a day-to-day basis, 95% plus of what I eat is going to be animal products. It's very rare that I'm eating non-animal products, but depending on your situation, there are options there. And, I don't think everyone needs to be 100% strict carnivore. I think there are unique advantages to being a strict carnivore, to being carnivore, primarily carnivore. And so that's what I have settled on. That's what works best for me. And that's been for, over 4 years now. And then for 3 or 4 years before that, I was, different variations of low carb keto kind of approach. As I said, there are different ways to do this depending on what problems you're experiencing, where you are in your metabolic health. These different options are going to be available to you. Ultimately, what I want people to come to is judging what they're eating based on their metabolic health. And if what you're eating is improving your metabolic health or maintaining good metabolic health, then, I have no issues with that. But if you're basing what you're eating on something besides metabolic health, for instance, just looking at your cholesterol levels, I think that can lead you down the wrong pathway. And so that's why I focus so much on metabolic health. I go into, what is metabolic health? How do we assess it? And then whichever dietary strategy you ultimately think is right for you, that should be your measuring stick as to whether that truly is a good dietary approach for you to be taking.
Yes, totally agree. It's very liberating that you take this approach because, well, it makes it far more accessible for most people. I had another question, so I'm going to take you back a little bit in the book because there's another section of the book where you talk about the 7 principles of metabolic health. Can you pick out 1 or 2 and tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, so, the first principle I talk about there is looking at your health as a system, not as a goal. And what I mean by that is that we oftentimes get too focused on short-term goals when it comes to our health. We say something like, I want to lose 20 pounds. And when you do that, one of 2 things is going to happen. You're going to make some changes and hopefully you lose the weight, you meet your goal. But then our inclination is to say, okay, I did what I set out to do. And you tend to go back to the habits that you were doing before that. The other possibility is that you don't lose the 20 pounds and you get frustrated and you give up and you end up going back to your own habits. And instead, the way that I want people to think is, around their health as a system. I want to be healthy. I want to be metabolically healthy. And I need to find the habits that are going to support that. And I think it's a more positive and a more sustainable way to think about this. And I find that it leads to better results ultimately.
Yes.
Yeah, some of the other principles I talk about are, eating real food, which we've already touched on, getting adequate sleep, managing your stress. And one of the other principles I talk about is finding a practitioner who understands this and can help you through it. We all need guides. We all need coaches, when we're trying to do these things. And so you want to seek out, maybe it's a physician, maybe it's a health coach, dietitians, there are lots of practitioners that can help you with this, but find someone who understands this so that they can guide you through the process. And again, this is an active thing that you need to do. If you just end up going to your local physician, because that's who's near you or that's who your insurance company has told you need to go see, chances are they're not going to be in tune to this stuff. Like we talked about, this isn't, kind of mainstream in the medical system, and you may not get the support that you need. In many cases, you might get discouraged from trying these things, again, because of these outdated preconceived notions that lots of doctors have around nutrition. And so you need to actively seek out people who can support you in this journey. No one can do this alone. Find a practitioner, find someone who can support you in your journey.
Yes, great advice. We talked about insulin resistance, about metabolic health. Are there any numbers, any measurements people can have done, any tests they can have done to get a good view on what their metabolic health is like?
Yeah, so there are 5 basic measures of metabolic health, and I talk about these in the book, and I go through them in detail. But basically, these are 5 measures that I think everyone needs to know for themselves. The first one, real easy, you can measure it at home. It's your waist circumference. So, just take a tape measure. You measure it just above the level of your belly button. Best thing to do it is first thing in the morning. The next thing you want to look at is your blood pressure. And you want your blood pressure to be well controlled without the use of medications. High blood pressure is oftentimes one of the early indicators of a metabolic health problem.
Yeah.
And then there's some basic blood work that most physicians do these days. They just don't look at it in the proper context. So your fasting blood glucose, the amount of sugar that's in your blood when you haven't eaten for about 8 to 12 hours, is another important metric of metabolic health. Mm-hmm. Your HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, is another measure of your metabolic health. And finally, your triglycerides are the last measure of your metabolic health. So the first step is getting these measurements done, figuring out where you stand on them. I give all the numbers in the book. You can also go to my website, ifixhearts.com, and you can get all the numbers there that you should be aiming for to determine if you are metabolically healthy or not.
Yes, great advice. And we talked a bit about the LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol. What I find quite often is when people start a keto diet or a carnivore diet, that most of the lipids change for the good. HDL goes up, triglycerides go down, but LDL doesn't always go down. It often even goes up. And most physicians, most doctors will say, well, there you go. It's a bad diet because LDL is going up. What would you say to people who are faced with this, and what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so this is a big problem because we have become so focused on LDL cholesterol, and the medical system is so convinced that this one number is the all important number. And there are a couple of things that I point out to people. The first is that when we look at people who are metabolically healthy, who are not insulin resistant, there is no data that shows us that having a higher LDL cholesterol number is dangerous in that situation. There's data actually that suggests that it's beneficial, that people live longer when they have higher LDL cholesterol levels if they are metabolically healthy. So getting metabolically healthy is the first priority there. There's also a lot of, LDL as a single number is, not a good predictor of overall health or heart health in particular. We have plenty of data showing that many patients, possibly more than half of the patients who come in with a heart attack, have low LDL cholesterol numbers. And conversely, there are lots of people walking around with high LDL cholesterol numbers that never have heart attacks and have no evidence of heart disease. It turns out there are subtypes of LDL. LDL is a family of particles, and what your particle sizes look like is actually a much more important predictor of heart disease risk than the total amount of particles that you have. But this is, it's a complex issue. Quite frankly, most doctors don't understand it well. And again, this is where finding a doctor who does understand this can be beneficial. And finally, what I point out to people is even if we accept that LDL, having a higher LDL cholesterol, is a negative predictor of health. When we look at the risk associated with that, and we compare it to the risk associated with poor metabolic health and insulin resistance, we see that insulin resistance is a much bigger predictor of heart disease risk than elevated LDL cholesterol. So in the end, even if you're making that trade-off, you've reversed your insulin resistance, but your LDL cholesterol went up some, you're still having a net positive effect, when it comes to your heart disease risk. So cholesterol is a very complex issue. It's not as simple as looking at one measure on a blood test. And if all your doctor can do, if all they understand is that one number, and all they know is that one number is above a certain level, that must be bad, that can be a sign that it's time to find a different physician to work with, because they really don't understand the complete issue around cholesterol.
Well, I think that's great advice for everyone who's now listening and viewing this interview. Do you have one final tip for people? Where can they start?
Yeah, so the way to start is basically to understand what metabolic health is, why it's so important, and then work on improving it. And I think that really is what I tried to do with the book. I tried to keep the explanation of that at a level that everyone can understand, and then everyone can put into practice to help them improve their health. So ultimately, my advice is you need to take control of your health. You need to be in charge of your health. You can't rely on someone else to be doing this for you.
Yes, exactly. Power to the people. Where can they find more about you on the internet?
Yeah, sure thing. So my website, ifixhearts.com, is really the best place to start. On social media, I'm kind of everywhere. On Twitter is where I'm most active, at ifixhearts. I can also be found over on Instagram, YouTube. I have my own podcast. It's called the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast, and I invite people to check that out as well.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And now we have the book here in Holland and Belgium available as well in Dutch. I'll put a link in the show notes so people can find the book and get it and read it and start working on their own metabolic health and try to stay off the operating table of their cardiologist. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this. You wrote this book and it's now translated into Dutch. Thank you so much. And I hope this information gets out there, gets more known to people, so they can start working on their own health. Thank you so much. And maybe we'll see you one day here in the Netherlands.
I hope so. Thanks for having me.
That would be great. Thank you. Okay.